The crackling hum of warning alarms filled the cockpit, each tone more urgent than the last. Valera's four-fingered hands darted across the controls of her sleek Zelvari vessel, the Bytheron-class scout ship trembling violently with every gust of the merciless storm outside. The vast white expanse of Caliver stretched beneath her like an endless death shroud, the swirling blizzard below rendering even the most advanced navigational systems nearly useless. The ship groaned in protest as another wave of icy turbulence rocked it, and for the first time in her life, Valera felt something alien to her, a genuine spike of fear. Not for herself, but for the small form seated just behind her. Ilixa, she called, her voice sharp but tinged with worry. She craned her neck just enough to catch a glimpse of her son, his golden eyes wide with both awe and terror. The child was wrapped in a thermal cocoon, the metallic fibers barely enough to keep the biting cold at bay. His small frame shivered, and Valera's heart clenched. "Stay in your seat and hold on. Do not move unless I tell you." Her son nodded mutely, his gaze fixed on her with an intensity that belied his age. Elixir was only 8 solar cycles old, a mere hatchling by Zelvari standards, but he had inherited his mother's fierce spirit. It was that spirit Valera clung to as she fought to keep the ship airborne. Yet even she, a decorated scout and survivalist, could see the odds stacking against her. The storm was unlike anything she had encountered in her years of exploration. Caliver's frigid winds hammered the ship with the force of battering rams, and every diagnostic screen glowed an angry red. System integrity, 12%. Hull damage, 34%. Propulsion offline. The numbers painted a grim picture, but Valera refused to give in. Failure was not a concept she entertained, not as a Zelvari, and certainly not as a mother. She yanked the manual override lever, her muscles straining against the resistance as she guided the craft toward a nearby canyon that appeared marginally sheltered. The ship bucked violently, a deafening metallic screech reverberating through the cabin as one of the stabilizers sheared away. Sparks rained down from the control panel, and the acrid smell of burning circuits filled the air. "Elixir, brace yourself," she shouted, gripping the controls tightly as she prepared for impact. The ship slammed into the icy ground with a force that jarred every bone in her body. The sound was a cacophony of tortured metal and shattering ice as the vessel skidded across the frozen terrain before grinding to a halt. For a moment, there was only silence, save for the faint whine of the dying engine and the howling wind outside. Valera's chest heaved as she assessed the situation, adrenaline surging through her veins. "Elixir," she said again, her voice softer now, but no less urgent. She unbuckled her harness and half crawled, half stumbled to the back of the cabin. Her son was still cocooned in his seat, his small face pale but alert. His wide eyes met hers, and she felt a wave of relief as he reached out to her. "I'm okay, Mother," he whispered, his voice trembling but steady. Valera cupped his face with one hand, her usually stern expression softening. "You did well, my son, but we're not safe yet." The cold was seeping in through the cracked hull, and Valera knew they wouldn't last long in these conditions. Caliver was unforgiving, its sub-zero temperatures capable of freezing even the hardiest of life forms within hours. She quickly scanned the interior of the ship, her sharp eyes taking stock of what little remained intact. The emergency supply crate was still secured near the rear bulkhead, and she wasted no time prying it open. Inside, she found a small portable heater, thermal blankets, a basic medkit, and a week's worth of nutrient rations, barely enough for one adult, let alone a mother and child. Valera gritted her teeth, pushing down the rising sense of panic. Panic served no purpose. She grabbed the blankets and wrapped one tightly around Elixir, her hands lingering on his shoulders. "I will keep you safe," she said firmly, more to herself than to him. Elixir nodded, his trust in her absolute. Using the remains of the ship's interior, Valera constructed a makeshift shelter. She worked quickly, her movements precise and methodical despite the gnawing cold that was beginning to stiffen her joints. The ship's structural panels became walls, and the portable heater was placed at the center, its faint hum providing the only semblance of warmth. As she worked, her mind raced. The Zelvari were a proud and independent species, renowned for their resilience and self-reliance. Asking for help was considered a weakness, an admission of failure. But Valera was a mother first, and her son's life outweighed her pride. She activated the emergency beacon, the faint signal pulsing out into the storm. Would anyone hear it? The odds were slim. Caliver was a desolate moon, its only visitors being researchers, traders, or the occasional foolhardy explorer. Valera had no idea who or what might answer her call, but she had no other choice. The hours dragged on, the storm outside growing fiercer. Valera huddled close to Elixir, her body shielding him from the worst of the cold. The heater struggled to maintain its warmth, and her own strength was beginning to wane. She could feel the frost creeping into her limbs, sapping her energy with every passing moment. Elixir stirred in her arms, his small voice breaking the silence. "Mother, will someone come?" Valera hesitated, her usual confidence faltering. She didn't want to lie to him, but she couldn't bear to extinguish the faint glimmer of hope in his eyes. "They will come," she said finally, her voice steady despite the doubt gnawing at her. "We will survive this, Elixir, together." As the storm raged on, Valera tightened her hold on her son, her crimson eyes scanning the darkness beyond the shelter. Somewhere out there, perhaps far beyond the storm's reach, someone might be listening. Someone who could help. Unbeknownst to her, a human explorer named Stephen was already picking up the faint distress signal, his brow furrowing as he braced himself for what lay ahead. The wind howled outside Stephen's small research outpost, its mournful cry reverberating against the reinforced walls. He sat hunched over a cluttered workstation, the glow of the holographic interface casting shadows across his rugged face. The readout before him was a mix of topographical data, weather analysis, and the monotonous telemetry reports from his atmospheric drones. It was supposed to be just another day cataloging Caliver's erratic climate, but then the signal came. A faint, irregular blip appeared on his console, a sound so soft it barely rose above the background noise of the storm. Stephen froze, his fingers hovering above the controls as he squinted at the display. The signal was alien, no question about it. The frequencies were encrypted in a way human systems didn't use, and the intermittent pattern suggested distress. His pulse quickened as he ran a diagnostic sweep, pinpointing the source amidst the chaos of the storm. Coordinates? 47.92 by 13.08, he muttered to himself, pulling up the map. The location was deep within the storm's epicenter, where visibility would be near zero and winds would exceed safe levels for any hovercraft. He leaned back in his chair, the hum of the console fading into the background as he weighed his options. On Earth, they had a name for this kind of situation, a fool's errand. But Stephen had never been good at ignoring distress signals. It wasn't just a professional obligation, it was personal. Years spent as a rescue engineer before he transitioned into research had ingrained in him a simple philosophy. If someone needed help, you answered. No exceptions. "Damn it," he muttered, running a hand through his unruly hair. The storm outside raged like a living thing, its ferocity almost daring him to try. Stephen rose from his chair, already grabbing his insulated jacket. His hovercraft wasn't designed for conditions this extreme, but he'd made enough field modifications over the years to give it a fighting chance. And if someone was out there, alien or not, they wouldn't last long without help. The craft trembled beneath him as Stephen piloted it into the storm, its stabilizers straining against the relentless gusts. Snow and ice battered the reinforced windshield, forming an opaque layer that the wipers struggled to keep clear. The controls vibrated under his hands, a constant reminder of how precarious his journey was. He glanced at the navigation display, the blinking beacon of the distress signal guiding him like a lighthouse in a sea of chaos. "Just hold on," he murmured to whoever might be listening, though he knew they couldn't hear him. His jaw tightened as the wind howled louder, the craft lurching violently as it hit a pocket of turbulence. The terrain below was a blur of jagged ice formations and treacherous crevices, each one a potential death trap if his craft lost altitude. The closer he got to the signal's origin, the worse the conditions became. His hands moved instinctively across the controls, compensating for the sudden shifts in wind pressure and keeping the craft steady. The heater struggled against the cold, frost creeping along the edges of the cockpit as the temperature plummeted. Stephen's breath fogged with each exhale, but he ignored the discomfort, his focus razor-sharp. At last, the scanner picked up the faint outline of a crash site. Stephen's heart sank as he adjusted the hovercraft's altitude, circling the wreckage. The ship was unlike anything he'd ever seen. Its sleek, alien design was partially obscured by a thick layer of snow, but even through the storm's haze, he could tell it was in bad shape. One wing was completely sheared off, and the hull was riddled with cracks that exposed its inner workings to the elements. Stephen landed the craft as close as he could safely manage, the thrusters kicking up a flurry of snow as he touched down. The wind howled as he stepped out, the cold biting through his layers within seconds. Pulling his thermal hood tighter, he grabbed his rescue kit and trudged toward the wreckage, each step sinking into the deep, unforgiving snow. The inside of the ship was barely warmer than the storm outside. Stephen's flashlight cut through the darkness, revealing a chaotic scene of shattered equipment and scattered debris. His boots crunched against the frost-covered floor as he made his way deeper into the wreck, his breath misting in the frigid air. Then he saw them. Huddled in a makeshift shelter at the far end of the cabin were two figures, a woman and a child. The woman's skin was a deep, iridescent blue, her features sharp and angular, yet strikingly humanoid. She was crouched protectively over the smaller figure, a child wrapped in layers of thermal material that did little to hide his shivering. Crimson eyes snapped to Stephen as the woman rose, her movements quick despite the obvious toll the cold had taken on her. "Stay back," she barked, her voice carrying an unmistakable edge of authority. Her accent was thick, the words clipped but intelligible. She positioned herself between Stephen and the child, her posture defensive despite her weakened state. Stephen raised his hands, palms outward in a gesture of peace. "I'm here to help," he said, keeping his voice calm and steady. "I picked up your distress signal." The woman's eyes narrowed, suspicion etched into every line of her face. "Why would a human risk themselves for strangers?" she demanded, her tone laced with mistrust. Her kind didn't believe in altruism. Every action had a motive. "Because if I don't, you and your kid won't make it," Stephen replied bluntly. He gestured to the child, whose labored breathing was audible even over the storm. "I have a heater in my craft, better thermal blankets, and medical supplies. Let me help you." For a long moment, the woman said nothing, her gaze flickering between Stephen and her son. Finally, she stepped aside, though her posture remained tense. "If you harm him," she warned, her voice low and dangerous, "there is no corner of the galaxy where you will be safe." Stephen didn't doubt her for a second, but he had no intention of breaking her trust. He knelt beside the child, his practiced hands quickly assessing the boy's condition. The child, Elixir, the woman had called him, was hypothermic, his pulse weak but steady. Without wasting time, Stephen wrapped him in a thick thermal blanket from his kit and activated a portable heater, the device humming to life as it began to warm the air around them. The woman watched every movement with hawk-like intensity, her breath hitching when Elixir stirred and let out a faint whimper. Stephen glanced up at her. "He'll be okay," he assured her, "but we need to get him to better shelter. My outpost isn't far." Her eyes narrowed again, but this time the suspicion was tinged with something else, reluctant gratitude. She gave a curt nod. "Very well, but I go with you." "Of course," Stephen said, rising to his feet with Elixir cradled carefully in his arms. The child clung to him weakly, his small hands clutching at the human's jacket. As Stephen led them back to his hovercraft, the wind howled louder, the storm seeming almost sentient in its fury. Yet, amidst the chaos, Valera found herself watching this strange human with a mix of awe and confusion. He was unlike anything she had expected, resilient, determined, and above all, kind. It was a concept she didn't fully understand yet, but she was beginning to realize that her survival, and that of her son, depended on this human's inexplicable compassion. The storm raged relentlessly, the icy wind screeching like a vengeful beast outside the shelter of Stephen's hovercraft. Inside, it was far from comfortable, but it was warm. The portable heater worked tirelessly, casting a faint orange glow that painted shifting shadows on the craft's interior. Stephen sat cross-legged near the heater, carefully adjusting its settings to ensure the device didn't overheat. Across from him, Valera sat with her son, Elixir, still wrapped in layers of thermal blankets. Valera had said nothing since they boarded the hovercraft. She sat rigid, her iridescent blue skin glowing faintly in the dim light, her crimson eyes fixed on Stephen. The silence was thick, charged with tension. It was clear she didn't trust him. Why would she? Humans and Zelvari were barely aware of each other, separated by countless light years and vastly different cultures. But the look in her eyes wasn't just suspicion. It was exhaustion. The kind of exhaustion that came from carrying the weight of survival on your shoulders for too long. Stephen broke the silence first, his voice soft but firm. "You're going to need to eat something. Both of you." Valera's gaze flickered toward him, her expression unreadable. "We don't need your pity, human," she said sharply, though her tone lacked its earlier venom. Stephen raised an eyebrow. "It's not pity. It's practicality. You've been through hell out there, and your body's burning energy just to stay warm. I have nutrient packs. They're not gourmet, but they'll keep you alive." He gestured toward a compartment near the rear of the hovercraft. Valera hesitated, glancing down at Elixir, who stirred faintly in her arms. The boy's golden eyes fluttered open for a moment, his small face pale and drawn. Her protective instincts flared, but she knew Stephen was right. Survival wasn't about pride. With a reluctant nod, she unwrapped one of the blankets, exposing her son to the warmer air inside the craft. "Stay here," she murmured to Elixir, her voice softer now, almost tender. The boy nodded weakly, his trust in her absolute. Valera moved with fluid precision, her movements quiet as she retrieved the rations. Her every step was measured, her gaze constantly shifting between Stephen and her surroundings. She inspected the packaging of the nutrient bars with a critical eye, her sharp nails testing the seal for any sign of tampering. Satisfied, she returned to her seat, breaking off a small piece of the bar and offering it to Elixir first. Stephen watched the exchange in silence. There was something almost reverent about the way Valera cared for her son, as if he were the last precious thing in a universe determined to take everything from her. After ensuring Elixir had eaten enough, Valera reluctantly tried the nutrient bar herself. She grimaced at the taste, her sharp teeth tearing into the dense, flavorless material. "Humans eat this?" she asked, her tone laced with disdain. Stephen chuckled softly. "Not by choice. But it does the job." Valera said nothing, her gaze drifting back to Elixir, who had finally drifted into a fitful sleep. For a moment, her stoic mask slipped, and Stephen caught a glimpse of the raw emotion beneath. The fear, the guilt, the unyielding determination to protect her child at any cost. "Why?" she asked suddenly, her voice low but firm. Stephen blinked. "Why what? Why are you helping us?" Valera's crimson eyes locked onto his, searching for any sign of deceit. "You could have ignored the signal. You could have left us to die." Stephen leaned back against the wall of the hovercraft, crossing his arms over his chest. "Because it's the right thing to do," he said simply. Valera scoffed, her lips curling into a bitter smile. "There's no such thing as right in the galaxy. There's survival. There's power. Everything else is a lie." Stephen frowned, her words striking a chord he hadn't expected. "Maybe where you're from," he said quietly, "but that's not how I see it. I've been in tight spots before. I've had people risk their necks for me when they didn't have to. If someone hadn't believed in doing the right thing, I wouldn't be here now." Valera's expression softened, but only slightly. "Your people, they value weakness." "No," Stephen corrected her. "We value life." The two stared at each other in silence, the tension between them shifting into something less hostile, though no less intense. For the first time, Valera seemed to consider the possibility that Stephen's motives weren't entirely selfish. As the hours dragged on, the storm outside showed no signs of abating. Stephen busied himself with monitoring the hovercraft systems, ensuring they could maintain heat and power until the worst had passed. Valera stayed close to Elixir, her sharp eyes never straying far from Stephen. Occasionally, he would speak small, inconsequential things about Earth, its diverse climates, its people. Valera listened without comment, her expression unreadable. But something in his voice held her attention. There was a warmth there, an openness she wasn't accustomed to. At one point, Stephen pulled a small device from his jacket, a simple entertainment pad filled with Earth music and images. He activated it, and soft, melodic tones filled the cabin. Valera tilted her head, her sharp ears twitching slightly at the unfamiliar sounds. "What is that?" she asked. "Music," Stephen replied, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Humans make it to express emotions. Joy, sadness, hope, you name it." Valera frowned, her fingers twitching slightly as the music continued. "Emotions are a distraction. They cloud judgment." Stephen chuckled. "Maybe, but they're also what make life worth living." Valera didn't respond, but she didn't ask him to turn it off either. As night fell, though it was hard to tell beneath the perpetual darkness of the storm, Valera finally allowed herself to rest. She leaned back against the wall of the hovercraft, her son nestled safely in her arms. Despite the lingering tension between her and Stephen, the warmth of the craft and the steady hum of the heater lulled her into a state of uneasy calm. Stephen, seated across from her, watched as her eyes fluttered closed. For the first time since he'd found them, she looked almost peaceful. But he knew better than to let his guard down entirely. The Zelvari woman was formidable, her every movement calculated, her every word a weapon. Still, there was something about her, a quiet strength, a fierce determination, that Stephen couldn't help but admire. She was unlike anyone he'd ever met, and though she clearly didn't trust him, he found himself hoping he could prove her wrong. As he settled in for the long night ahead, Stephen glanced at the sleeping child in Valera's arms. He didn't know what the future held for them, for any of them, but he knew one thing for certain. He would do whatever it took to ensure they survived this. The storm might have been merciless, but for the first time in days, Stephen felt a flicker of hope. Not just for Valera and Elixir, but for the unlikely bond forming between two strangers from worlds apart. And perhaps, just perhaps, that bond would be enough to weather even the harshest of storms. The storm outside roared like an untamed beast, clawing at the fragile safety of the hovercraft with unrelenting fury. Every gust seemed intent on tearing them apart, as though Caliver itself had decided it wanted no trespassers. Inside, the atmosphere was tense, the heater's low hum providing the only steady sound against the chaos outside. Stephen sat at the controls, his fingers deftly working the panel as he calibrated the stabilizers for the journey ahead. The hovercraft vibrated under his touch, straining against the immense pressure of the icy winds. Behind him, Valera sat coiled like a spring, her arms wrapped tightly around her son, Elixir, who had yet to stir beyond a weak murmur. Her crimson eyes glinted with sharp distrust, following Stephen's every move. "Whatever you're doing, human, it needs to work," she said, her tone cutting through the quiet tension. "My son won't survive a mistake." Stephen didn't look back, but responded in a measured voice. "I don't plan on making one." Valera's gaze lingered on him a moment longer before she turned her attention to Elixir, gently pulling his blanket tighter. The boy's golden eyes flickered open for a second, his gaze filled with a fragile light that made her heart ache. He whispered something faint, something she couldn't quite make out, but she pressed her forehead against his, murmuring, "Rest, my little flame. I won't let anything harm you." Stephen cleared his throat, glancing at them over his shoulder. "The stabilizer should handle most of the wind shear, but we'll still feel it. It's going to be rough. Hang on to him tightly." Valera shot him a look that said she needed no such reminder. "I know how to protect my child," she said coldly. Stephen sighed, muttering under his breath, "Of course you do." He didn't have the energy to argue. The storm had already drained most of his mental reserves, and they hadn't even started the journey yet. The hovercraft lifted off the ground with a groan, its engines straining against the howling winds. The snowstorm wrapped around them like a living thing, blinding and oppressive. Stephen's grip on the controls tightened as the craft lurched to one side, the stabilizers compensating just in time to prevent a disastrous tilt. Valera's body tensed at the motion, her claws digging into the seat's armrest as she instinctively tightened her grip on Elixir. "Is this what you call control?" she snapped. "Welcome to Caliver," Stephen replied, his voice clipped. "It's not exactly a smooth ride." The craft jerked again, and this time Valera's patience cracked. "If this vehicle of yours is as sturdy as you claim, it should be able to handle some wind," she said, her voice laced with skepticism. Stephen turned his head, just enough to shoot her a glare. "I don't know how they do things on your world, but here, this is about as good as it gets. Unless you want to step out and walk." Valera said nothing, but her gaze burned into him, her silent defiance louder than any words she could have spoken. The storm grew fiercer as they pressed on. Snow whipped against the craft in endless waves, each gust threatening to push them off course. Stephen kept his focus on the navigation panel, his every muscle taut with concentration. He knew they were walking a fine line. One misstep, one wrong calculation, and they would plunge into the icy abyss below. Behind him, Valera watched the human with reluctant admiration. His hands moved with practiced precision, his every action deliberate. She had underestimated him. She could admit that much. Humans were fragile creatures by Zelvari's standards, their bodies soft and their technology primitive. Yet this one seemed to possess a resilience she hadn't expected. Elixir stirred against her chest, drawing her attention away from Stephen. The boy's breathing was shallow, his golden eyes fluttering open for a moment before closing again. Valera brushed a hand over his forehead, her touch gentle despite the claws that tipped her fingers. "You must stay strong, my son," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the storm. "You are Zelvari. Strength is in your blood." The journey stretched on, the minutes bleeding into what felt like hours. The hovercraft shuddered under the weight of the storm, but it held, its reinforced structure managing to withstand Caliver's wrath. Stephen stole a glance at the navigation display, his heart lifting slightly as he saw the faint outline of his base appear on the screen. "We're close," he announced, his voice carrying a note of relief. Valera perked up at his words, her crimson eyes narrowing. "How close?" "About a kilometer," Stephen replied. "We'll be there in a few minutes if the wind cooperates." Valera's grip on Elixir tightened. She could feel the subtle shift in the air, the faint promise of safety just beyond the storm. But she knew better than to relax. Caliver was a cruel moon, and she wouldn't trust its mercy. The hovercraft suddenly jolted, throwing Stephen forward against his harness. The console blared a warning, and his eyes darted to the display. "What's happening?" Valera demanded, her voice sharp. "Downdraft," Stephen said, wrestling with the controls. "The wind's pushing us down hard. I need to adjust the stabilizers manually." He flipped a series of switches, the hovercraft groaning in protest as it fought to regain balance. Valera could feel the strain in the air, the subtle vibrations that told her how close they were to losing control. "Fix it," she said, her tone more command than request. Stephen didn't bother responding. His focus was entirely on the task at hand, his fingers flying over the controls as he worked to steady the craft. After a tense moment, the hovercraft leveled out again, the warning lights on the console dimming. "Got it," he said, exhaling a shaky breath. Valera said nothing, but her eyes lingered on him for a moment longer. There was something in his expression, a quiet determination, a refusal to give up, that unsettled her. It wasn't weakness. It was something else, something she couldn't quite define. Finally, the base came into view. It was a squat, reinforced structure built into the side of a rocky outcrop, its surface coated in frost. The sight of it filled Stephen with relief. He guided the hovercraft toward the entrance, the craft settling onto the icy ground with a heavy thud. "We're here," he said, turning to Valera. She wasted no time. She unbuckled herself, carefully lifting Elixir in her arms. The boy's breathing was still shallow, but there was a flicker of light in his eyes that hadn't been there before. Stephen stepped out of the craft first, the wind immediately slamming into him with brutal force. He leaned into the gale, motioning for Valera to follow. She emerged a moment later, her son held tightly against her chest, her posture defiant against the storm. The two of them trudged toward the base, the snow clinging to their clothes and skin. Stephen keyed in the access code, the heavy metal door sliding open with a hiss. Warm air spilled out, a stark contrast to the bitter cold outside. Valera stepped inside without hesitation, her eyes scanning the interior with a mixture of curiosity and wariness. The base was small but functional, its walls lined with equipment and supplies. Stephen followed, closing the door behind them and sealing out the storm. For the first time since the crash, Valera allowed herself to exhale. She looked down at her son, her hand brushing over his face. "We're safe now," she murmured, though her tone carried more relief than certainty. Stephen watched her from a few steps away, his expression unreadable. "There's a medical station in the back," he said. "It's basic, but it should help him." Valera met his gaze, her crimson eyes softening just enough to reveal a flicker of gratitude. "Thank you," she said, the words slow and deliberate. Stephen nodded, turning toward the back of the base. "Let's get him settled," he said. And so, for the first time since the storm began, hope found a foothold on the icy moon of Caliver. But as Valera followed Stephen deeper into the base, her son cradled in her arms, she couldn't shake the feeling that their journey was far from over. Inside the confines of Stephen's base, the howling of the storm faded to a dull roar, muffled by the thick, reinforced walls. The sharp contrast between the biting cold outside and the warmth within was disorienting, almost surreal. Valera stood just inside the entryway, her son cradled in her arms. The bluish hue of her skin glowed faintly under the artificial lighting, a sheen of frost still clinging to the edges of her cloak. Stephen motioned toward the far side of the room, where a small medical station was tucked into an alcove. The space was functional, its design efficient rather than comforting. A simple cot, a diagnostic scanner, and a cabinet of basic medical supplies made up the extent of it. "Set him down there," Stephen said, his tone brisk but not unkind. Valera hesitated for the briefest moment. Her instinct screamed against the idea of trusting a stranger, especially a human, with her son's care. But Elixir's shallow breaths and pale complexion reminded her that she didn't have the luxury of distrust. She carried him to the cot, her movements precise and deliberate, and laid him down gently. The boy stirred, his golden eyes opening halfway. "Mother," he murmured, his voice weak. "I am here," Valera said softly, brushing a hand over his forehead. "You must rest now. Let the human help." Elixir's gaze flickered toward Stephen, who was already retrieving equipment from the cabinet. The boy's expression was wary, but he was too exhausted to protest. Stephen worked quickly, his movements practiced and efficient. He activated the diagnostic scanner, the device humming faintly as it passed over Elixir's small frame. A holographic display lit up, lines of alien physiology rendered in sharp detail. Stephen squinted at the readout, his brow furrowing as he deciphered the information. "He's hypothermic," Stephen said, more to himself than to Valera. "Core temperature's dangerously low, and he's dehydrated." He opened a pack of electrolyte solution, connecting it to an line. "This'll help stabilize him, but he needs warmth. More than this room can provide." Valera's eyes narrowed. "What are you suggesting?" Stephen gestured toward the heater in the corner of the room. "That thing isn't strong enough for someone in his condition. I have a thermal chamber in the back. It's meant for emergencies. It'll warm him gradually without shocking his system." Valera bristled at the suggestion. The thought of placing her son into a machine, even one meant to save his life, set her nerves on edge. "Your machines are fragile," she said coldly. "What if it fails?" Stephen met her gaze, his voice firm. "It won't. I've used it before on myself, even. It works." The tension between them hung heavy in the air, but Valera could see no alternative. With a reluctant nod, she stepped back, allowing Stephen to lift Elixir from the cot. The thermal chamber was a cylindrical device tucked into a small room at the rear of the base. Its exterior was sleek and metallic, with a control panel embedded into its side. Stephen opened the chamber, revealing a padded interior lined with heat-regulating panels. "It'll look strange," Stephen said as he gently placed Elixir inside. "But it's perfectly safe. You won't feel a thing." Valera hovered nearby, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. She watched every movement with hawk-like intensity, her sharp eyes darting between Stephen and the machine. Once Elixir was secure, Stephen activated the chamber. A faint hum filled the room as the device powered on, its interior lighting up with a soft amber glow. The display on the control panel showed the gradual increase in temperature, carefully calibrated to avoid overstressing the boy's fragile system. Stephen stepped back, wiping a hand across his forehead. "That should do it," he said, exhaling deeply. "It'll take a few hours, but he'll start recovering." Valera didn't respond immediately. She stood motionless, her gaze fixed on the chamber as if willing it to succeed. Her usual stoic expression faltered, a crack of vulnerability slipping through. "Thank you," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Stephen blinked, surprised by the unexpected gratitude. He gave a small nod. "You don't need to thank me. I'm just doing what anyone would do." Valera's crimson eyes snapped to his. "Anyone?" she echoed, a bitter edge to her tone. "You and I both know that is not true. Most would have left us to die." Stephen didn't argue. He knew she wasn't wrong. But he also knew that dwelling on what others might do wouldn't change the fact that he was here, and he'd made his choice. The hours passed in uneasy silence. Stephen busied himself with routine tasks, restocking supplies, checking the base's systems, and preparing rations. Valera stayed by the thermal chamber, her presence an unyielding vigil. She refused to sit, refused to rest, as if her very vigilance could will her son back to health. At one point, Stephen approached her with a tray of food. "You should eat," he said, offering it to her. Valera glanced at the tray, her expression unreadable. "Zelvari do not require sustenance as frequently as humans," she said, though her tone lacked its usual sharpness. "Maybe not," Stephen said, setting the tray on a nearby table. "But you'll be no good to your son if you collapse from exhaustion. Just consider it." Valera said nothing, but after a long moment, she moved to the table and began eating in small, measured bites. Stephen watched her for a moment before returning to his work. As the hours stretched into the night, the storm outside began to wane. The howling winds softened to a low, mournful wail, and the vibrations that had rattled the walls earlier faded into a distant hum. Stephen checked the chamber's readout, nodding to himself. "He's stabilizing," he said, glancing at Valera. "His core temperature's back to normal, and his vitals are improving." Valera stepped closer, her eyes scanning the display. She didn't fully understand the human's technology, but she could see the truth in the numbers. Relief washed over her, though she quickly buried it beneath her usual stoicism. "When can he leave the machine?" she asked. "Soon," Stephen said. "I want to give him a bit more time to recover, but he should be okay by morning." Valera nodded, her posture relaxing slightly. For the first time since the crash, a faint glimmer of hope took root in her chest. Later that night, as the two sat in the base's main room, Valera broke the silence. "You risked much for us," she said, her voice measured. "Why?" Stephen glanced at her, then leaned back in his chair with a sigh. "I told you. It's the right thing to do." "Many would claim that," Valera said, her tone skeptical. "Few would act on it." Stephen met her gaze, his expression serious. "I'm not like most people. I've seen what happens when no one helps. I've been in situations where I needed someone to take a chance on me, and they did. I'm just paying it forward." Valera studied him for a long moment, her sharp features softened by the flickering light of the heater. "Perhaps your kind is not as weak as I believed," she said finally, her voice quiet. Stephen smirked faintly. "High praise coming from you." Valera didn't respond, but the faintest hint of a smile tugged at the corner of her mouth. As dawn broke over Caliver, the storm finally subsided, leaving the moon's surface bathed in an eerie, pale light. Inside the base, the thermal chamber powered down, its door hissing open. Valera was the first to reach it, her heart pounding as she lifted her son into her arms. Elixir's eyes fluttered open, brighter and more alert than they had been in days. "Mother," he murmured, his voice stronger now. "I am here," she said, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "You are safe." Stephen stood nearby, watching the reunion with a small smile. He didn't interrupt, letting the moment belong to them. For the first time, Valera turned to him and bowed her head, a gesture of respect in Zelvari culture. "You saved him," she said simply. "For that, you have my gratitude." Stephen nodded, his expression softening. "I'm just glad he's okay." As Valera cradled her son, a quiet understanding passed between her and Stephen, a fragile but growing bond forged in the crucible of survival. For both of them, the journey wasn't over, but for now, they had found a moment of peace amidst the chaos. And in that moment, it was enough. The stillness after the storm was almost as unsettling as the storm itself. Outside, the pale light of Caliver's twin moons bathed the frozen landscape in a cold, ethereal glow. Ice crystals shimmered in the frigid air, remnants of the blizzard that had ravaged the surface for days. Inside Stephen's outpost, the warmth of the heater created a stark contrast, wrapping the small space in a cocoon of fragile safety. Valera sat at the edge of the medical cot, where Elixir now lay resting. The boy's breathing was steady, his golden eyes half-lidded but clear. He clung to her hand, his small fingers wrapped around hers with surprising strength. She didn't move, didn't dare to disturb the tenuous peace that had finally settled over them. Across the room, Stephen stood near his workstation, adjusting the outpost's external sensors. He worked with quiet efficiency, but his attention frequently drifted toward the mother and son. Valera had said little since Elixir was removed from the thermal chamber, but Stephen could sense the tension in her shoulders, the way her sharp eyes flickered toward him every so often. "Everything's clear outside," Stephen said, breaking the silence. "The storm's gone. The system shows stable conditions for the next 48 hours. After that, it's anyone's guess." Valera didn't respond immediately. She stroked Elixir's cheek absently, her expression thoughtful. Finally, she looked up, her crimson eyes locking onto his. "And what happens next, human?" she asked, her tone measured. Stephen leaned against the console, folding his arms. "That depends on you. Your ship's wrecked. It's not going anywhere without major repairs. And I'm guessing you don't have a backup beacon on you, do you?" Valera shook her head. "Our primary distress signal was part of the ship. When it crashed, she trailed off, the weight of her words hanging in the air. Then we're stuck here until someone comes looking for you," Stephen said. "And if no one's coming, we make other plans," Valera finished, her voice firm. Stephen nodded. "Exactly." Over the next few hours, they worked together to assess their situation. Valera reluctantly allowed Stephen to examine the remains of her ship, and they ventured outside while Elixir rested inside the outpost. The cold was biting, even with the storm gone, and the wreckage was half buried in snow and ice. "This isn't just damage, it's obliterated," Stephen said, brushing snow off a twisted section of the hull. "The propulsion system's totaled, and most of the energy cells are shot. I can salvage some parts, but it won't be enough to get this thing off the ground." Valera stood nearby, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. Her cloak billowed slightly in the icy breeze, the faint glow of her skin contrasting against the stark white of the landscape. "What can you salvage?" she asked, her tone sharp but curious. Stephen crouched beside a shattered control panel, prying it open with a multi-tool. "Your power relays look intact. They're more advanced than anything I've seen. If we integrate them into the outpost system, it'll give us a much stronger signal boost. Might even be enough to reach someone out there." Valera raised an eyebrow. "You think you can combine human and Zelvari technology?" Stephen glanced up at her with a small smirk. "I made stranger things work. You'd be surprised how often duct tape and stubbornness get the job done." Valera's expression remained skeptical, but there was a flicker of something else. Respect. "Do what you must," she said, stepping aside to let him continue. Back inside the outpost, Stephen set up a makeshift workstation near the primary communications array. The salvaged Zelvari components were spread out before him, their sleek design and faintly glowing surfaces a stark contrast to the rugged, utilitarian look of the human equipment. Valera hovered nearby, her arms crossed as she observed him work. She had little patience for the intricacies of human technology, but she was fascinated by Stephen's determination. His hands moved with precision, his focus unshakable as he soldered, calibrated, and connected the alien components to the base's system. "Your technology is primitive," she remarked after a while. Stephen chuckled, not looking up from his work. "Maybe, but it's reliable. And right now, that's what matters." Valera tilted her head, studying him. "You're different from what I expected of your kind." Stephen paused, glancing at her. "Oh yeah? What did you expect?" "Fragility," she said bluntly. "Arrogance. Humans are known for their short lives and reckless tendencies." Stephen raised an eyebrow. "And now?" Valera's gaze lingered on him for a moment. "You've shown resilience," she admitted, "and resourcefulness, qualities I did not anticipate." Stephen smirked, returning to his work. "I'll take that as a compliment." As the hours passed, Stephen's modifications began to take shape. The communication array hummed with renewed energy, its signal range amplified by the Zelvari relays. The once flickering console now displayed a steady green light, indicating a clear and powerful broadcast. "It's done," Stephen said, leaning back with a satisfied sigh. "This should get someone's attention, if they're out there to hear it." Valera stepped forward, her eyes scanning the console. "And if no one responds?" Stephen met her gaze, his expression serious. "Then we figure something else out. But for now, we wait." The waiting was the hardest part. Valera spent most of her time by Elixir's side, tending to him as his strength slowly returned. The boy was resilient, much like his mother, but the ordeal had left him weakened. Stephen checked on him periodically, offering subtle reassurances that the boy would recover. During the quieter moments, Stephen and Valera talked. The conversations were cautious at first, but gradually, the walls between them began to lower. Valera shared fragments of her life, a life shaped by the harsh expectations of her people, where survival was a constant battle and vulnerability was considered a flaw. Stephen in turn spoke of Earth. He described its diverse landscapes, its vibrant cultures, and its imperfections. He admitted to missing it, though he had chosen to leave it behind for the sake of exploration. "You gave up your home willingly?" Valera asked one evening, her voice laced with curiosity. Stephen shrugged. "I wanted to see what else was out there. Guess I got more than I bargained for." Valera tilted her head. "That? I can understand." On the third day, a faint signal crackled through the console. Stephen rushed to the controls, his heart pounding as he adjusted the frequency. Valera was at his side in an instant, her sharp gaze fixed on the screen. "This is Zelvari Vessel Arathon, responding to distress signal," a voice said, distorted but clear enough to understand. "Identify yourself." Valera leaned forward, her voice steady but urgent. "This is Valera of the scout vessel Thalnara. We are stranded on Caliver. 2 survivors. Requesting immediate extraction." There was a pause. Then the voice replied, "Coordinates received. Extraction team en route. Estimated arrival, 6 hours." Valera exhaled, relief washing over her. "Understood. We will be ready." Stephen leaned back, a small smile tugging at his lips. "Looks like you're getting off this rock after all." Valera turned to him, her expression softening. "Because of you." As the hours ticked down, Stephen helped Valera and Elixir prepare for their departure. The boy was strong enough to walk now, his golden eyes bright with curiosity as he explored the base. When the extraction ship finally arrived, Valera stood at the threshold of the outpost, her son at her side. She turned to Stephen, her crimson eyes meeting his. "You have done more than I could have asked," she said. "More than I believed possible. My son lives because of you." Stephen nodded, his voice quiet. "I just did what I could." Valera hesitated, then extended her hand, a rare gesture of respect among her people. Stephen took it, their grasp firm. "Perhaps our paths will cross again," she said, her tone carrying a note of hope. "Maybe," Stephen replied, a small smile on his face. "Take care of yourself, Valera." With that, Valera and Elixir boarded the extraction ship, its engines humming as it lifted off. Stephen watched until it disappeared into the sky, leaving him alone on the icy moon once more. But for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel alone. A connection had been forged, fragile yet enduring, like a flame against the cold. And as Stephen turned back to his outpost, he felt a warmth that even Caliver's frigid winds couldn't extinguish.